This story began with a bouquet placed in the wrong spot. That was all it took. One arrangement sitting in a position that anyone trained in funeral floristry would know was wrong. But in that room full of the most powerful faces in Chicago that night, no one noticed. No one except a 27-year-old woman named June, who had been hired to arrange flowers and disappear. She had no idea the woman lying in the casket was the mother of the most feared Mafia boss in the city. She had no idea the man standing 5 steps away from her could order someone erased with a single phone call. And she had absolutely no idea that what was hidden inside that bouquet would drag her into a war between blood, where the dead woman might not be the only victim, and the killer was still sitting in the front row. If this story kept you until the very end, hit like and share it so others can hear it too. And if you want to follow the next stories, subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode. That night, before the misplaced bouquet pulled everything down, Kent Gallagher was sitting in the private room behind Meridian Restaurant, one of the 17 establishments belonging to the business empire the Gallagher family controlled across Chicago. Across from him sat a man in middle age, his face pale, both hands resting on the table as though he were trying to keep them from shaking. This man owed the family a large sum of money and was already 3 months overdue. Kent didn't raise his voice. He only pushed a sheet of paper across the table and said, his voice as mild as if they were discussing the weather, "Sign it. Or tomorrow, I'll let someone else explain it to you." The man looked at the paper, looked at Kent, then picked up the pen and signed. Not a single word of protest. In Chicago, people didn't need to hear Kent Gallagher make a threat. They only had to look into his eyes to understand everything. Walsh, Kent's right-hand man, stepped in at the exact moment the debtor had just put the pen down. But Walsh didn't look at the man. He went straight to Kent's side, bent down, and murmured a few words. Kent's face didn't change. Not one wrinkle shifted, not one muscle twitched. He stood up halfway through the meeting, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and walked out of the room without looking back at the man sitting across from him. As if that man didn't exist. As if the entire world had suddenly become unworthy of his gaze. In the car, Walsh drove, and Kent sat in the back seat. Silent, the city slipped backward past the window, but Kent didn't look outside. He stared straight ahead, both hands resting on his thighs, his back straight, his jaw clenched tight. Eleanor Gallagher, his mother, the only woman in the world Kent Gallagher obeyed, had just died at the family estate. The official diagnosis was a stroke. Walsh didn't dare say anything more. He knew when he should keep quiet. Kent gave only 2 orders. The first order was, "The funeral must be perfect. My mother deserves that." The second order was to call Attorney Perry and demand that Eleanor's will be held back. No one was allowed to announce it until Kent permitted it. Walsh nodded and took out his phone. At the same time, in the South Side, nearly 1 hour's drive from the Gallagher estate, the phone in June Whitfield's small flower shop began to ring. On the other end of the line was the voice of a polite, cold man, requesting all the floral arrangements for the Gallagher funeral. June heard the name Gallagher without knowing how much weight it carried in this city. To her, it was only an order, but it was the largest order she had received since her grandmother died 2 years earlier, leaving her this flower shop, along with a pile of debts and a notebook filled with the meanings of every kind of flower. June worked through the night. The next morning, she loaded the flowers into an old truck borrowed from a neighbor and drove to the Gallagher estate. The iron gate was twice her height. 2 guards in black suits stopped her, searched every corner of her tool bag, and lifted every layer of floral wrapping paper to inspect it. One of them looked her up and down, then said, "Hurry up. Go in and get out. Don't wander around." June looked straight into his face. "You can search all you want, but don't break a single flower stem. Each one costs more than my day's pay." The guard raised an eyebrow but said nothing else. They opened the gate. June stepped inside. The mansion was so vast that the sound of her footsteps seemed to be swallowed whole between the stone walls. Everyone coming and going was dressed in black, speaking in low voices, every pair of eyes sharp and watchful. No one looked at her for more than 2 seconds, but she felt it clearly. Every person in this house was dangerous in their own way. This wasn't a family in mourning. This was an empire holding its breath. June was led by a housemaid into the large room where Eleanor Gallagher's coffin had been placed at the center. She began to work, arranging each bouquet in the exact order her grandmother had taught her since she was a little girl. White flowers at the head of the coffin, pale-colored flowers on both sides, funeral wreaths arranged from the inside out, according to the order of family members first, then guests. Her grandmother used to say that funeral flowers weren't decoration, but the final goodbye, so every blossom had to lie exactly where it belonged. June worked quickly, neatly, trying not to look at anyone around her. She knew she didn't belong in this place, and the sooner she finished, the better. But when she moved to the left side of the coffin, her eyes stopped on one bouquet. That bouquet was lying close to the foot of the coffin, wedged between two large funeral wreaths. Wrong. Completely wrong. Anyone who had ever learned the rules of funeral flowers would know that position wasn't meant for this kind of bouquet. It had been placed there, as if someone had deliberately shoved it in without understanding anything about the ritual. Or they did understand, but didn't care, because their purpose wasn't to mourn the dead. June bent down and lifted the bouquet to put it back where it belonged. The moment her hand touched the stems, she felt something hard and small hidden among the branches and leaves. She gently parted the flowers. A black device, no bigger than the tip of her thumb, had been neatly tied to the flower stems with thin wire. June didn't know what it was. She had never seen anything like it in her life, but the instinct of someone who had lived long enough in the South Side told her that this thing shouldn't be here, and that she shouldn't be holding it in her hand. She hadn't had time to put the bouquet down when a hand clamped tightly around her wrist from behind, so hard that she almost dropped the bouquet. June turned around. Kent Gallagher was standing right behind her, his eyes lowering to the black device inside the bouquet, then lifting straight to her face. There was no explosive anger on his face. Worse than that, it was the absolute coldness of a man deciding whether she lived or died. Kent pulled her out of the large room, through the hallway, and into a smaller room. The door closed. Walsh stood guard outside. "Who are you?" Kent asked. His voice wasn't loud, but every word was as heavy as stone. "Who sent you here?" June didn't answer right away. She lowered her head and drew in a breath. Her heart was pounding so hard that she could hear its rhythm in her ears. This wasn't like the guard at the gate. The guard had only looked down on her. The man standing in front of her now could make her disappear without anyone knowing. But June also knew that if she stayed silent, he would fill that silence himself with the worst possible answer. She looked up, her voice trembling but clear with every word. "I'm June Whitfield. I sell flowers. I was hired to come here and decorate the funeral. That bouquet was in the wrong place, so I picked it up to fix it. And then I saw that thing inside. I don't know what it is. I don't know who put it there. And I don't know who you are." Kent stared at her without blinking. He didn't say she was lying. He didn't say she was telling the truth either. He only looked at her, as if he were weighing every breath she took to see if any part of it was false. Then he tapped lightly on the door. Walsh stepped in. "Check this girl. Name, address, flower shop, bank accounts, acquaintances, everything." Walsh nodded and walked out. 15 minutes later, Walsh came back. June Whitfield, 27 years old, lived alone in a rented apartment in the South Side, owned a small flower shop inherited from her grandmother, was 3 months behind on rent for the storefront, had no criminal record, and had no connection to any gang or organization. Clean. So poor that there was less than $200 left in her bank account. Kent listened, then stayed silent for a while. Then he looked at June again. She was still standing in the corner of the room, both hands clasped tightly together, not begging, not explaining any further, just standing there and waiting. Kent said, "You're not leaving here until I say you're allowed to. You're the only person who saw what was inside that bouquet before anyone had time to clean it up. If the person who put it there finds out, you'll be in much bigger trouble than being held inside my house." June opened her mouth, about to protest. But when she looked into Kent's eyes, she understood that it wasn't a threat. It was the truth. Eleanor Gallagher's funeral took place the following afternoon. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects, from politicians and businessmen to faces the press would never dare publish in photographs. Kent stood in the front row, dressed in a black suit, his face expressionless, receiving every handshake, every word of condolence, knowing that at least half of them were false. He stood there like a statue carved from cold stone, carrying out his final duty to his mother with the absolute perfection he had ordered. But there was only one thing in his mind. The black device the flower girl had found inside the misplaced bouquet. As soon as the last guest left, Kent called Walsh into his study. The device had been sent to one of the family's technical specialists for analysis. The result lay on Kent's desk. It was a specialized recording device, the kind not sold on the ordinary market, worth thousands of dollars, designed to run continuously for 48 hours without needing to be charged. It wasn't something an amateur could buy. Whoever had placed it inside the funeral bouquet had money, had a plan, and had access to this house without drawing anyone's suspicion. Kent finished reading the report and placed it face down on the desk. He said nothing for nearly 1 minute. Walsh stood across from him, waiting. Then Kent opened a drawer, took out a second phone, the kind registered under no name, and called a man whose number only he had, an independent forensic doctor, someone who had worked for the family in matters that required absolute discretion. Kent ordered him to retest Eleanor's blood sample, the one Kent had privately had someone collect before the hospital handled the body. The doctor said he needed 2 days. Kent said, "You have 1 day." 24 hours later, the result lay on Kent's desk. The forensic doctor came directly to the mansion, sat across from Kent and Walsh, and opened the file. In Eleanor's blood, there were traces of a rare pharmaceutical compound, the kind that, when used in the correct dosage over a long period of time, would cause symptoms almost perfectly resembling a stroke, a sudden spike in blood pressure, a ruptured blood vessel in the brain, a death that looked like a natural illness, one no emergency doctor would suspect unless they knew exactly what to look for. Someone had poisoned Eleanor Gallagher slowly, patiently, methodically, and disguised it as death by illness. After the forensic doctor finished explaining, he looked at Kent, waiting for a reaction. Kent gave none. He sat still, both hands resting on the desk, his eyes lowered to the file. He didn't slam the table. He didn't shout. He didn't grind his teeth. His face was so calm it became frightening, like the surface of a lake just before a storm breaks over it. Walsh, who had followed Kent for more than 10 years, recognized it at once. This wasn't calm. This was Kent Gallagher's most dangerous voice. His most dangerous state, when anger didn't flare upward but sank down, compressed into something colder, slower, and more ruthless. Kent set the file down and said to Walsh, his voice low and even, "Find me who bought this thing. Find me who touched my mother's food in her final 48 hours. Kent didn't sit and wait for Walsh to search. That very night, he drove himself to the industrial district in South Chicago, a place even the police were reluctant to enter after 10 o'clock at night. He stopped the car in front of an old warehouse and walked in alone. Inside, a man was sitting behind an iron desk cluttered with papers. This was the most notorious black market pharmaceutical dealer in the Midwest, the man who supplied every kind of substance a hospital would never prescribe. The dealer recognized Kent the moment he stepped through the door. His face went a shade paler, but he tried to stay calm, leaned back in his chair, and said he didn't want to get involved in family business, that he was only a small-time operator. Kent didn't sit down. He took out his phone, dialed a number right in front of the dealer, said one brief sentence into the phone, and hung up. 60 seconds later, the dealer's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. A notification from the bank. All accounts had been frozen. Current balance 0. The dealer looked up, and now his eyes could no longer pretend to be calm. Kent said, "I don't ask twice." The dealer talked. About 3 months earlier, someone had bought that pharmaceutical compound through an intermediary, paid entirely in cash, and left no name behind. But the dealer remembered the intermediary's face because he had done business with that person several times before. His name was Nolan. Kent listened, then turned and walked out of the warehouse without looking back. Nolan. That name echoed in his mind the entire drive home. Nolan, the trusted man he had always believed was loyal. Nolan, the man who came and went from the Gallagher mansion as freely as a family member. Nolan, the man who always stood beside his Uncle Grant at every party, every meeting. While Kent was following Nolan's trail through the streets of Chicago, June Whitfield sat in the small guest room that had been assigned to her on the second floor of the Gallagher mansion, looking out the window and thinking about her flower shop. She wondered whether the orchid pots on the shelf had been watered, wondered whether someone had called to order flowers and no one had picked up the phone. But she couldn't go home, and if Kent Gallagher said she stayed here, then she stayed here. That had been clear from the way the 2 guards took turns standing outside the hallway all day and all night. June wasn't the kind of person who sat still and waited for someone else to decide her fate. She had taken care of herself since she was 15, when her grandmother began to grow weak, and she had kept the flower shop alive by herself through 2 winters, when customers were so scarce that she had to sell even the pot of chrysanthemums displayed outside the front door just to have enough money to pay the electricity. Bill. If she couldn't leave the mansion, then at least she would find a way to understand why she was being kept there. June began with small conversations. In the morning, when the maid brought breakfast to her room, June asked about Mrs. Eleanor. She didn't ask about the death, didn't ask about the family, only asked about flowers. What kind of flowers did Mrs. Eleanor like best? The maid was cautious at first, but a question about flowers was harmless, and June asked in the voice of a florist who truly cared about a customer, not in the voice of someone trying to pry. The maid said Eleanor loved white lilies and always placed a fresh vase of flowers on the tea table every week. June nodded, remembered it, then asked one more thing. Did she drink tea in the afternoon? The maid said yes, every day, at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, never changing. At noon, June happened to meet the butler in the hallway when she asked permission to get some water. She asked him about Eleanor's daily habits by saying she wanted to understand her better, so she could arrange a memorial bouquet that would suit her wishes, if the family allowed it. The butler was an older man who had served the Gallagher household for more than 20 years, and when he spoke about Eleanor, his voice warmed as if he were speaking about his own mother. He said, Mrs. Eleanor lived in a very orderly way, ate simply, and rarely changed her menu. But then he mentioned one detail that made June stop. About 2 months before Eleanor died, Mr. Grant, Kent's uncle, had suggested that she change her afternoon tea. Mr. Grant said her private doctor had advised her to switch to a new herbal tea, one that was good for her heart and her sleep. Eleanor didn't want to change at first, because she had been used to the old tea for dozens of years, but Grant patiently persuaded her, even bringing the new tea box to the mansion with his own hands. And in the end, Eleanor agreed. From then on, every day at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she drank that tea. The butler finished telling the story and changed the subject, thinking nothing more of it. But June thought. She thought a great deal. That night, June knocked on the door of Kent's study. The guard outside the door looked at her with suspicion, but went in to report it. A few seconds later, the door opened. Kent was sitting behind the desk, with piles of documents in front of him and the second phone he always kept separate. He looked at June with the gaze she had grown used to, cold, assessing, measuring, but at least it was no longer the gaze that had wanted to erase her from existence on the first day. June stepped inside, stood 2 steps from Kent's desk, and told him directly what she had found. 2 months before Eleanor died, Grant had changed her afternoon tea, brought the tea himself, and Eleanor had drunk it every day from that point on. Kent didn't say anything right away. He looked at June. This time, it wasn't a look of suspicion, and it wasn't a threatening look either. It was the look of a man completely reassessing the person standing in front of him. "Why do you care about this?" he asked, his voice slower than usual. "You're only a florist. You could sit quietly in your room, wait for me to finish handling this, and then let you go home. Why are you going around asking questions?" June looked at Kent. She didn't lower her head the way she had the first time they met, but she didn't try to act brave either. She only spoke in an ordinary voice, as if she were stating an obvious truth that didn't need to be explained. "Because she was my customer. My flower shop accepted her final order. She chose me to arrange flowers for her own funeral, and my customer didn't deserve to die like that." The room fell silent. Kent looked at her for a few more seconds. Then he pulled out the chair across from him and gave a slight nod. "Sit down." It was the first time Kent Gallagher had invited the flower girl to sit at the same table with him, and June understood that from this moment on, she was no longer just a witness. After the conversation with Kent, June returned to her room on the 2nd floor. She couldn't sleep. Her mind kept spinning with everything that had happened over the past few days. The listening device hidden inside the bouquet, the forensic results that Walsh had accidentally mentioned while talking to the guard outside the hallway, which she had overheard, the tea Grant had brought to Eleanor, and the way Kent had looked at her when he pulled out the chair for her to sit. But there was one thing gnawing at the back of her mind, something she hadn't had time to think about because everything had happened too quickly. The flower order. The final flower order her shop had received from the Gallagher household before the funeral. June searched through the tool bag the guards had returned to her after the funeral. Inside was the order notebook, the one her grandmother had used more than 20 years earlier, and the one June continued to use because she didn't have enough money to buy management software. She turned page after page until she found the most recent order from the Gallagher house. There it was, the flower order Eleanor's butler had called in about 1 week before she died. June read the list of flowers Eleanor had requested, and this time, she read it with different eyes. Not with the eyes of a florist checking inventory, but with the eyes of the little girl who had once sat on her grandmother's lap every evening, listening as the old woman explained that every flower had its own language, its own story, and that anyone who understood that language could hear the words people didn't dare speak out loud. Eleanor had requested 3 kinds of flowers. The first, oleander. June's grandmother had once taught her that oleander was the flower of caution, a warning of danger waiting in the shadows. In the classical Western language of flowers, giving someone oleander meant telling them, "Be careful, something isn't right." The second, belladonna, another name for deadly nightshade, which meant a deadly poison. June's heart skipped a beat as she realized Eleanor knew exactly how her health was being targeted. The third, monkshood. When June read the name of that flower, her hand stopped. Monkshood, her grandmother had once said in a very serious voice, was the symbol of a hidden enemy, a traitor concealed close beside you, inside your own house, inside your own family. Her grandmother had said that in old times, people tucked monkshood into wreaths sent to enemies they couldn't confront face to face, as a silent accusation. June sat motionless on the bed, the notebook open on her lap. 3 flowers. Caution, there is danger. A funeral for herself. An enemy inside the family. This wasn't an ordinary flower order. This was a message. Eleanor Gallagher hadn't ordered flowers for decoration. She had ordered flowers to say what she couldn't say in words, to someone she trusted would understand. Then June remembered the card. She shot to her feet, searched through her tool bag again, and turned out every small compartment. It was here, the handwritten card, tucked neatly inside the inner zippered pocket, where she had slipped it just days before, and then completely forgotten it. The card had been sent along in the old flower basket the Gallagher household had returned to the shop, following the habit Eleanor had kept since the days when June's grandmother was still alive. Every time she ordered new flowers, she would return the old basket with a thank you card. But this card didn't say thank you. The handwritten strokes trembled slightly, the ink a little blurred in one corner, as if the person writing had been in a hurry or had been weak. On it, there was only one line. "You're so much like your grandmother. Remember to read this flower order carefully." When June had first received this card, she had smiled, thinking the familiar old customer was simply reminiscing about her grandmother, writing a few warm words out of affection. She had tucked it into her bag and thought no more of it. But now, sitting inside the Gallagher mansion, after learning that Eleanor had been harmed, after reading the 3 coded flowers in the order, that line carried an entirely different meaning. Remember to read this flower order carefully. Eleanor hadn't written it for fun. She had written it because she knew she was being slowly harmed, day after day, through each cup of afternoon tea. She couldn't tell Kent because she feared he would act too rashly and fall into a trap. She couldn't tell anyone in the family because she didn't know whom to trust. So she had chosen to speak in the only language that just one person in this world could read, the language of flowers. And that person was the granddaughter of her old florist, the poor girl from the South Side whom Eleanor had never met face to face, yet trusted through her faith in a grandmother who had already passed away. June sat on the bed, both hands clutching the card, crying without a sound. June didn't wait until morning. She wiped her eyes, took the order notebook and the card, then went straight down to Kent's study. The guard outside the door stopped her, but June said she had important information Kent needed to hear immediately. The guard went in to report it. The door opened. Kent was still sitting behind the desk, still in the black suit he hadn't changed out of since the funeral, with the same piles of documents in front of him and the unregistered phone still beside them. He watched June step in near midnight, with the worn old notebook and a small card in her hand, his eyes asking without his mouth needing to open, "What do you want?" June placed the notebook on Kent's desk, already open to the order page, then set the card beside it. She said, "This is the final flower order, Mrs. Eleanor called into my shop, about 1 week before she died. She requested 3 kinds of flowers: oleander, which means caution, there is danger; belladonna, which means a deadly poison; and monkshood, which means the enemy is right inside the house." June paused and pointed to the card. "And this is the card she sent along in the old flower basket she returned, handwritten, sent to me before she died. She told me to read this flower order carefully." Kent didn't look at the notebook. He looked at June. The silence stretched long enough for June to hear the wall clock behind him clearly. Then he spoke, his voice slow, each word deliberate. "You're telling me my mother sent a code through flowers?" June didn't step back. "I'm telling you that Mrs. Eleanor knew the language of flowers. She was a regular customer at my grandmother's shop for more than 10 years, from the time I was still a little girl sitting in the corner of the shop folding floral wrapping paper. My grandmother and Mrs. Eleanor talked about flowers for hours, about the meaning of every species, every color, every arrangement. She knew that language well, and she knew that if she sent this flower order to my shop, I would be the only person who could read it." Kent still didn't look at the notebook. He picked up the phone, called Walsh, and ordered him to check the old customer records from June's grandmother's flower shop and match them against the name Eleanor Gallagher. 5 minutes later, Walsh called back and confirmed it. Yes, Eleanor Gallagher had been a monthly flower customer at that shop for decades, long before June was even born. The connection was real. Kent hung up. This time, he looked down at the card. He picked it up with both hands and read his mother's handwriting. "You're so much like your grandmother. Remember to read this flower order carefully." The strokes trembled. The ink blurred in one corner. This was the handwriting of someone growing weaker, someone writing in haste, someone trying to send a message she knew might be her last. Kent held the card, and June saw something she didn't think she would ever see in this man. His hand trembled, only for an instant, so faintly that if she hadn't been looking straight at his hand, she would have missed it. Then he set the card down, gripped the edge of the desk, and the tremor disappeared, pressed down beneath the layer of control he had spent his entire life building. "My mother knew she was going to die," Kent said, his voice lower and rougher than usual. Not the voice of anger, not the voice of command. It was the voice of a man swallowing pain into his chest so it wouldn't rise to his face. "She knew who was harming her. She knew she wouldn't survive. And she didn't tell me. She told you, a florist she had never met face to face." June didn't know what to say. She stood still, letting that sentence rest in the space between them, heavy, needing no one to hold it up. She understood that Kent wasn't blaming her. He was hurting because he had realized his mother had been afraid. Eleanor Gallagher, the strongest woman this family had ever known, had been afraid enough that she hadn't dared tell the truth to her own son, because she knew her son would charge straight into confrontation and might fall directly into the trap the enemy had already laid. She chose another way. She sent a message through flowers, through a poor girl from the South Side whom no one in the family knew, no one suspected, no one followed. She wagered that the granddaughter of the florist friend from years ago would be able to read the language her grandmother had taught her, and she was right. Kent stood up. He no longer looked at June. He looked out the window, where the darkness of Chicago stretched beyond the glass. Then he spoke. His voice returned to cold, sharp control. Exactly the Kent Gallagher this whole city knew to fear. "Oleander, caution, monkshood, the enemy inside the house. You've told me what my mother wanted to say. Now I'll ask you one question. Who in my family touched my mother's tea?" That question wasn't meant for June. They both knew where the answer lay. It lay in the name Kent had heard from the black market dealer, the name that now led straight to the uncle he had called Uncle Grant for 33 years. The next day, while Kent quietly had Walsh watch Nolan's every move and began reviewing everyone who had access to the kitchen and the tea room inside the mansion, Grant Gallagher personally came to June's room. He knocked softly, 2 clean, polite taps, the kind of knock that belonged to a man used to being welcomed into any room in this house. June opened the door and saw a 45-year-old man, his hair neatly combed, wearing a white shirt tucked into his trousers, with a smile on his lips that was wide enough to seem friendly but not so wide that it felt false. He introduced himself as Grant, Kent's uncle, then asked whether she needed anything, whether she was comfortable here, whether people had treated her well. His voice was warm, concerned, exactly like that of an older uncle worrying about a guest in the house. "You've been here too long," Grant said, leaning lightly against the doorframe as if this were only an ordinary conversation between 2 acquaintances. "You must want to get back to your flower shop, don't you? I heard you have your own shop in the South Side. Work must be piling up. If you stay here like this, who's looking after the shop?" He paused, lowered his voice by half a tone, and added just the right measure of seriousness. "And to be honest with you, this place isn't safe for an ordinary girl. My family is going through a difficult time. There are a lot of complicated matters. You should go home, take care of your own life, and leave what's happening here to the people inside the family." June stood in the doorway, listening to every word. and looked into Grant's eyes. He was smiling, but his eyes weren't. Those eyes were flat, calculating, measuring every reaction on her face exactly the way a cat watches a mouse before deciding whether it needs to pounce. June had seen that kind of look before. In the South Side, the loan sharks who came to the flower shop to demand the rent spoke in voices just as sweet as that. They asked about her health, asked whether business at the shop was going well, and only then slowly turned the conversation toward money. The sweeter the voice, the sharper the blade hidden behind it. June had heard that voice enough times to know Grant hadn't come to her room out of concern. He had come because she was a problem, and he wanted the problem to leave on its own. But June wasn't the June of a few days ago, the girl whose hand had trembled when Kent grabbed her wrist in the funeral room. A few days inside the Gallagher mansion had changed her. She had sat at the same table with Kent Gallagher, had seen the hand of the Mafia boss tremble when he read his mother's handwriting, had decoded the final message of a dying woman. She was no longer afraid in the old way. June looked at Grant, not lowering her eyes, not stepping back, not giving him a polite social smile. She said, her voice calm, "Thank you, Uncle, but I'm used to living in difficult places. The South Side doesn't lack complicated matters, and I still open my shop every morning. I can stay." The smile on Grant's face didn't disappear at once. It hung there for a few more seconds, frozen, like a mask that had gotten stuck. Then he gave a slight nod and said, "Then get some rest," in a voice that was still sweet, but his eyes had changed completely. The false warmth vanished, replaced by a cold glint that flashed quickly before being covered again. He turned around and walked into the hallway. June closed the door, leaned her back against it, and only then did she realize her hands were slightly damp with sweat. She wasn't afraid of Grant the way she had been afraid of Kent the first time they met. She feared Grant in a different way, the way a person fears a snake when they know it is venomous but don't know when it will strike. Outside in the hallway, Grant had walked about 10 steps when the smile vanished completely. His face returned to its true nature, cold, hard, and calculating. He took out his phone and dialed Nolan. When the other end picked up, Grant said only 2 sentences. "The flower girl won't leave. She knows more than she's letting on. Handle it." Then he hung up, slipped the phone into his jacket pocket, and continued down the hallway toward his own room. Grant didn't know that at the same time, at the other end of the hallway, Kent Gallagher was walking in the opposite direction toward his study. Kent saw Grant coming out of the area where June's room was. Uncle and nephew passed each other. Grant nodded in greeting, and Kent nodded back. Neither of them said anything. But after Grant disappeared around the corner of the hallway, Kent stopped walking. He stood still, looking toward the door of June's room. He didn't need anyone to report to him, didn't need a camera, didn't need Walsh to explain. Uncle Grant had just entered the room of the flower girl Kent was keeping as a witness, the only girl who knew about the listening device and the coded flower order. Kent's gaze darkened. He took out his phone and called Walsh. "Double the guards on the 2nd floor. No one is allowed near her room without a direct order from me." The next morning, June knocked on the door of Kent's study. She said she needed to go back to the flower shop to get the old order notebooks, the ones from when her grandmother was still alive, where every order Eleanor had placed for more than 10 years had been recorded. If Eleanor had sent a code in her final flower order, then it was very possible she had sent other signals before that June hadn't realized in time. She needed to compare them. Kent looked at her, silent. He didn't want her leaving the mansion, especially after seeing Grant go to her room the night before. But June was right. Those notebooks might contain more clues they needed. Kent hesitated for a few more seconds, then nodded and ordered Walsh to send 2 guards with her. "Don't take your eyes off her. Don't stop the car anywhere except the flower shop. Go and come back within 1 hour." June got into the car with the 2 guards. The car left the Gallagher mansion, drove through downtown Chicago, then turned toward the South Side. Everything was normal for the first 20 minutes, but when the car entered an empty stretch near the Southern Industrial District, where both sides of the road were lined with abandoned warehouses and rusted steel fences, a black truck suddenly shot out from an alley and blocked the road. The driver slammed on the brakes. Before the 2 guards could react, 3 men jumped down from the truck, opened the car doors, and subdued both of them in less than 1 minute. Fast, clean, professional, clearly planned in advance. One man grabbed June's arm and pulled her out of the car. She struggled, but his hand tightened like a vice. They took her into an abandoned warehouse a few hundred meters away, shoved her into a sealed room at the back, tied both her hands with rope to an old water pipe running along the wall, then shut the door. The room was dark, damp, the concrete floor cold. June sat with her back against the wall, breathing slowly. She was afraid, so afraid she could hear her heartbeat pounding in her throat, but she didn't scream. Screaming wouldn't help in a place where no one could hear. Her grandmother had once said that when something terrible happened, the first thing to do wasn't panic, but look around and see what could be used. June looked around. The room was empty, with only a few rotting wooden crates in the corner and a broken strip of metal from an old door hinge lying on the floor, about half a meter from her foot. She used her foot to drag the metal closer, then twisted her body so her hands could reach it. She began rubbing the rope against the sharp edge of the metal. Slowly. Each time she scraped it, a few more small fibers of the rope gave way, and her wrists rubbed against the rope, turning red, burning raw. But she didn't stop. She thought of her grandmother, thought of the flower shop, thought of Eleanor's card, and kept scraping. At the same time, at the Gallagher mansion, Walsh called the 2 guards who had gone with June. No one picked up. He called a second time. A third. Silence. Walsh stepped into Kent's study and said briefly, the car had lost contact. The 2 guards weren't answering their phones, and more than 40 minutes had passed. Kent was sitting behind the desk, reading a file. He stopped, set the file down. Then he stood, and in that moment, Walsh saw something he had never seen in more than 10 years of following Kent Gallagher. Kent's face changed. Not the familiar coldness, not the frightening calm he had kept when he learned his mother had been harmed. This was something entirely different, something more primal, more violent, and for the first time, it broke through the layer of steel control Kent had maintained his entire life. He kicked the chair aside. It slammed into the wall, and he roared, his voice echoing through the room. Find her, now. Walsh didn't ask anything else. He walked out, took out his phone, and began tracing Nolan's phone signal. Because if June had been taken, and if Grant was behind it, then Nolan was the one who had carried it out. 10 minutes later, Walsh located the position, the Southern Industrial District, exactly along the route June's car had taken. Kent got into the car. He brought no one except Walsh and a driver. No guns, no army, no complicated plan. When the car stopped in front of the warehouse, Kent stepped out and walked straight through the front entrance, alone, empty-handed. Inside, 3 or 4 guards were sitting in the front area of the warehouse. They saw a man walk through the main door in broad daylight, unarmed, without an escort, and when the light from the door fell across that man's face, they recognized him. Kent Gallagher, not someone sent in his place. Kent Gallagher had come personally. One of them dropped his gun immediately, set it on the floor, and backed into the corner. The second looked at the first, then dropped his too. The third ran straight out the back door without looking back. The leader, the last one still standing, looked around and realized he had been left alone. He looked at Kent. Kent looked at him. You have 10 seconds to walk out through the door, Kent said, his voice neither rising nor falling, flat as a tabletop. The man put down his gun and ran. Kent crossed the front area and reached the sealed room at the back. He opened the door. June was sitting with her back against the wall, both hands still tied to the water pipe, but the rope had already been rubbed more than halfway through. Her wrists were red, her skin scraped raw from rubbing again and again against the rope and the piece of metal. The metal strip was still in her hand, clenched tight. She looked up when she heard the door open, her eyes red, but there were no tears. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried the entire time she had been in that room. Kent looked at the nearly broken rope, looked at the metal in her hand, then looked into her eyes. He didn't ask, "Are you all right?" He pulled a small knife from his jacket pocket, cut through the rest of the rope, then took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "Let's go home." Only 3 words. In the car, Walsh drove, and Kent and June sat in the back seat. No one said anything. Chicago slipped backward past the windows, the streetlights sweeping bands of light across both their faces. June looked outside, both hands resting on her thighs, her wrists still red, still burning. Then she spoke softly, her voice hoarse from dryness. "My grandmother used to say that only the flower that survives the night dew can bloom most beautifully at dawn." Kent didn't answer. He stared straight ahead, his face expressionless, but his hand settled over hers. Lightly, not holding, not squeezing, just resting there, like a promise that didn't need to be spoken out loud. And his hand stayed there the whole way back. Kent didn't wait until morning. That very night, after bringing June safely back to the mansion and tripling the security around her room, he ordered Walsh to take Nolan. No noise, no chase. Walsh found Nolan at a familiar bar on the west side of the city, sitting there drinking alone as if nothing had happened. Walsh sat down beside him, placed a hand on Nolan's shoulder, and said exactly one sentence. Nolan looked at Walsh's face and understood at once that running wasn't an option. 20 minutes later, Nolan was sitting on an iron chair in the sealed room beneath Meridian Restaurant, the place where the Gallagher family handled matters that never appeared on paper. Kent stepped in. He pulled out the chair across from Nolan, sat down, and said nothing. On the table between them, there was only a pitcher of water and 2 glasses. Kent poured water into one glass and pushed it toward Nolan. Then he sat still. Nolan looked at the glass of water, looked at Kent, then looked back at the glass. He didn't drink. His hands rested on the table, his fingers clenched together, trying to keep them from trembling, but they trembled. The silence stretched on. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Kent didn't ask. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't tap the table. He only sat there and looked at Nolan with the eyes all of Chicago knew to fear. Eyes that weren't angry, weren't cold, but something worse. Patient. The patience of a man who knew with certainty that he would get what he needed, and was only waiting to see when. Nolan licked his lips. Sweat began to bead across his forehead. He wanted to say something. Wanted to ask why he was here. Wanted to deny. Wanted to explain. But Kent's silence made every sentence he thought of meaningless before it could leave his mouth. At last, Kent spoke, his voice ordinary, even gentle, as if he were inviting someone to have tea. Drink. There's nothing in it. I don't do things that way. He paused for exactly 1 beat, then added, his eyes never leaving Nolan's face. That's Grant's style. Those final 3 words broke Nolan. Not because Kent shouted. Not because Kent threatened him. But because that sentence confirmed that Kent knew everything. He knew Grant was behind it. He knew Nolan was the errand man. He knew how Eleanor had been harmed. And if Kent knew everything, and was still sitting here calmly pouring him water, it meant every piece had already been arranged. Every escape route had already been blocked, and the only thing Nolan could do to keep himself alive was tell the truth. Nolan confessed. He confessed in a fast, stumbling voice, like a man trying to spill everything out before his courage failed him. Grant had begun planning 4 months earlier, right after he accidentally learned the contents of Eleanor's will through Attorney Perry. The will would officially strip Grant of every remaining measure of power in the family, transfer everything to Kent, and set a condition to move part of the operation into legality. Grant couldn't accept that. He had lived in his older brother's shadow all his life, then in the shadow of his nephew, and this will would turn him into someone completely unnecessary. Grant bought the drug through the black market dealer, using Nolan as the intermediary. It was a drug that, when mixed into a drink in small daily doses, would slowly damage the vascular system, and after 2 to 3 months, would cause a stroke that looked entirely natural. Grant suggested that Eleanor change her afternoon tea, personally brought the new box of herbal tea to the mansion, and Nolan was the one who mixed the drug into the tea box every week when he came to the mansion to visit Grant. Eleanor drank it every day, at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, for 2 full months. As for the listening device inside the funeral bouquet, Nolan said that had been Grant's idea. He wanted to monitor Kent's reaction on the night of the funeral, to see whether Kent suspected anything about Eleanor's death, so he would know whether he was safe or whether he needed to run. Kent sat and listened from beginning to end. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask anything more. When Nolan finished speaking, the room sank back into silence. Kent looked at the glass of water still untouched in front of Nolan. Then he stood, fastened the button of his suit jacket, pushed the chair neatly back into place, and walked out of the room without looking back. Exactly the way he had left the room with the debtor at Meridian Restaurant on the first night. Exactly the way he had left the black market dealer's warehouse. Kent Gallagher always walked away without looking back, because he didn't need to look back at something he had already finished handling. Walsh was waiting in the hallway. How do we handle Nolan? Kent didn't stop walking. Keep him alive. I need him to repeat everything, every detail, in front of the whole family. Walsh nodded. Then Kent stopped, turned to look at Walsh, and said, "Prepare the meeting room at the mansion. Put everything in its proper place." Walsh looked at Kent for 1 more second. Then he nodded again, more slowly than before, his eyes showing that he understood everything in its proper place. Didn't simply mean arranging tables and chairs. Grant Gallagher called Nolan at 10 o'clock that night. No one picked up. He called again at 11 o'clock. Still silence. He called a third time at midnight. The phone number was no longer in service. 12 straight hours without being able to contact his most trusted man. For someone like Grant, wasn't an accident. It was a signal. Nolan had been taken. And if Nolan had been taken, then Kent knew. He knew everything. Grant sat in his private room at the mansion, staring at the dark phone screen, and for the first time in 4 months since he had begun planning, his hand trembled. But Grant wasn't the kind of man who sat and waited to be cornered. He reacted the way he always reacted when threatened. He attacked. Not Kent, because he knew he wasn't strong enough. He attacked what he believed was the easiest weakness to break. The flower girl. At 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 men Grant had hired from outside the family drove to June's flower shop in the south side. The shop was closed, dark, with no one inside. They broke the lock on the back door, poured flammable liquid all over the floor, then lit the fire. The flames began at the front flower counter, spread quickly across the old wooden shelves filled with flower pots, swallowed the small work table where June sat every day writing down orders, and licked up the wall behind the counter, where the only photograph of her grandmother hung. A black and white picture of the old woman standing in front of the flower shop on opening day more than 30 years earlier, smiling, holding a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. By the time the fire department arrived, June Whitfield's small flower shop was nothing but a collapsed black frame, smelling of wet ash in the late-night darkness of the south side. Walsh received the news from one of the family's contacts at 4 o'clock in the morning. He went to June's room and knocked. June opened the door, her eyes still heavy with sleep. Walsh said it briefly. Her flower shop in the south side had been set on fire last night. It had burned completely. No one was hurt because the shop had been empty, and the police were investigating. After Walsh finished, he stood there and waited. June looked at him. She didn't ask again. She didn't ask, did it all burn? Or is anything left? Because she knew the answer from the way Walsh looked at her, with the eyes of a hard man trying not to show pity because he knew she wouldn't want to be pitied. June said, "Thank you," in a normal voice, then closed the door. She stood in the middle of the room, alone. The flower shop. Her grandmother's flower shop. That tiny little shop her grandmother had opened with a lifetime of savings. The shop where June had grown up in the scent of fresh flowers and the sound of shears cutting stems. The shop she had kept alive at any cost after her grandmother died, selling even the display flower pots, falling 3 months behind on rent, staying up until 2 o'clock in the morning wrapping flowers to finish orders on time, all just to hold on to the only thing her grandmother had left her in this world. And now it was gone. The flower shelves were gone. The work table was gone. The notebooks that held more than 20 years of orders were gone. Her grandmother's photograph was gone. June went into the bathroom, closed the door, sat down on the cold tile floor, leaned her back against the wall, wrapped both arms around her knees, and cried. She didn't scream, didn't shout, didn't pound the wall. She only cried silently. The kind of crying where every sob is swallowed back into the chest. The kind of crying that belongs to someone so used to loss that she no longer has the strength to cry loudly. Kent received the news from Walsh 10 minutes later. He didn't ask for more details. He knew who was behind it. He went up to the second floor, down the hallway toward June's room. The guards nodded in greeting, and Kent signaled for them to step away. He stood in front of June's door. There was no sound inside. He lifted his hand to knock, then stopped. From inside the bathroom came the sound of muffled crying. Very small, almost impossible to hear if the hallway hadn't been so silent at 4 o'clock in the morning. Kent lowered his hand. He didn't knock. He didn't go in. He sat down right there, on the hallway floor, with his back against the wall outside her room. The head of the Gallagher family, the man all of Chicago had to bow to, sat on the cold tile floor at dawn, silent, waiting for a flower girl to finish crying. He didn't know how long she cried. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe half an hour. He didn't count. He only sat there, listening to each strangled sob through 2 layers of doors, and each sob felt like a blade cutting into the rage he was holding tight inside his chest. Grant had killed his mother, and now Grant had burned the flower shop of the girl his mother had trusted with her final words. Every second Kent Gallagher sat on that hallway floor gave him one more reason why what was about to happen to Grant would hold no mercy at all. The crying stopped. Silence lingered for a while. Then came the sound of running water in the bathroom, light footsteps, the bathroom door opening. June stepped into the main room, her eyes red, her face wet, her hair tangled. She walked to the bedroom door, opened it, and saw Kent sitting on the hallway floor, his back against the wall, looking up at her. She didn't know how long he had been there, but from the way he sat, from the wrinkled back of his suit jacket where it had pressed against the brick wall, she understood that he had been there from the beginning. The entire time she had cried, he had been right outside this door. Kent stood. He looked at her, not at her red eyes, not at the tear tracks on her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, into the deepest place, where the pain hadn't yet eased but the will was still intact. He said, "I'll find out who did this, and they'll pay." Then his voice lowered, softer, completely different from the Kent Gallagher the outside world knew. A voice that had once belonged only to his mother when she was alive, and now, for the first time, belonged to someone else. "I'll rebuild your shop." June looked at him. She didn't say thank you. She didn't nod. She only looked. And in that look, something changed. Something they both felt but neither of them named. Then June turned back into the room and closed the door softly. Kent stood outside in the hallway for a few more seconds, then walked away. He had a family meeting to prepare. 2 days later, every member of the Gallagher family received a notice from Kent. A full family meeting at the main mansion, 7 o'clock in the evening, for the purpose of announcing Eleanor Gallagher's will. No one was allowed to be absent. It was an order, not an invitation. The large meeting room on the first floor of the mansion had been carefully prepared. A long wooden table stood in the center of the room, 14 chairs arranged around it, every seat already assigned. Attorney Perry sat at the left corner of the table, his document case placed in front of him, his face tense but far calmer than it had been in the previous weeks, when Grant had still been threatening him into delaying the announcement of the will. Now Grant no longer had the power to threaten anyone, though he didn't know that yet. Grant arrived exactly on time. He entered the meeting room in a gray suit, his hair neatly combed, a polite smile on his lips, shaking hands with each family member as if this were only an ordinary evening. But his eyes kept sweeping the room, stopping on each face for a brief moment, before moving to the next. He was looking for Nolan. Nolan wasn't there. Grant sat down in his seat near the right corner of the table, across from Perry, and tried to keep his posture relaxed. But his index finger tapped lightly against the tabletop, a steady rhythm that didn't stop. Kent entered last. Behind him was June. She wore the simple clothes the maid had given her hair tied neatly back, her hands holding the old order notebook and the card. Several family members looked at her, raising their eyebrows, wondering why an outsider was present at a family meeting. Kent didn't explain. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, sat down, and signaled for June to stand behind his chair. Then he looked around the table, at each face, slowly, without hurry. Every small conversation in the room faded away. Silence. Kent stood. He didn't look at Perry. He didn't ask the attorney to open his document case. He didn't mention the will. Instead, he placed a small speaker in the middle of the table and pressed play. Nolan's voice filled the meeting room, trembling, stumbling, but clear in every word. Nolan recounted everything. Grant had begun planning 4 months earlier, after learning the contents of the will, had bought the drug through a black market dealer with Nolan as the intermediary, had ordered Nolan to mix the drug into the herbal tea box that Grant personally brought to Eleanor every week, so she would drink it every day for 2 months, until her body collapsed, and the stroke arrived, looking like a natural illness. Then came the listening device hidden inside the funeral bouquet, placed there so Grant could monitor whether Kent suspected anything on the night of the visitation. Nolan's voice told everything, leaving out no detail, because when he sat across from Kent Gallagher in the sealed basement room, Nolan understood that the truth was the only thing keeping him alive. The recording ended. The meeting room was so silent that the breathing of the 14 people around the table could be heard. Every pair of eyes turned toward Grant. He sat there, his face drained white, his index finger no longer tapping the table. Then he shot to his feet, his chair shoved backward and striking the wall, his voice bursting out like a howl. "This is fabricated." Nolan was forced to confess. My nephew locked him in a basement and made him say anything he wanted him to say. "Don't believe this!" Kent didn't answer. He opened the document case Walsh had prepared and began placing pieces of evidence on the table, slowly, one by one. First was the transaction ledger from the black market drug dealer, clearly listing the date, the amount of money, and the name of the intermediary. Second were security camera images from the industrial district showing Nolan meeting the dealer on the exact date recorded in the ledger. Third was the independent forensic report confirming traces of the drug in Eleanor's blood, the drug that caused symptoms resembling a stroke. Each piece of evidence lay on the wooden table like one more brick building a wall, and that wall blocked every escape route Grant could imagine. Grant looked at each sheet of paper, each photograph, and with every item set down, a little more blood left his face. But he still shouted, "Fake! All of it is fake! You people have no right!" His voice climbed higher and higher, thinner and thinner, like the cry of an animal cornered and still trying to bare its teeth. No one in the room said a word. They looked at the evidence on the table, looked at Grant, then looked at Kent, and in their eyes, the truth was clear. Then June stepped forward. She moved from behind Kent's chair to the front of the table, placing the open order notebook and Eleanor's handwritten card in the middle of the table, right beside the pile of evidence. The whole room looked at her, more than a dozen pairs of eyes belonging to some of the most powerful people in Chicago, fixed on the flower girl from the South Side. June drew in a breath. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "This is the final flower order, Mrs. Eleanor sent to my shop before she died. She requested 3 kinds of flowers. Oleander, which means caution, danger is coming. Monkshood, which means an enemy is hiding inside the family. And belladonna, another name for deadly nightshade, which represents a deadly poison." June paused and lifted the card. "And this is the card she sent me, handwritten, telling me to read the flower order carefully. Mrs. Eleanor knew she was being harmed. She couldn't tell anyone in the family because she didn't know whom to trust, so she spoke through flowers, because she knew I would be able to read it." The meeting room went utterly still. No one breathed loudly. The powerful men sitting around the table looked at the worn old notebook and the small card as though they were seeing the ghost of Eleanor Gallagher standing in the middle of the room, pointing straight at the face of the man who had harmed her. Grant looked at the card, looked at the notebook, then looked at June. And in that moment, everything inside him shattered. He lunged toward the table, his hand reaching for the drawer beneath the meeting table, yanking it open, and pulling out the gun hidden inside. He raised the gun, his hand shaking violently, the barrel aimed at Kent. Several people around the table shouted and shoved their chairs back, but Kent didn't move. He remained seated, his back straight, his eyes fixed on Grant, unblinking. He had known the gun was in that drawer. He was the one who had ordered it to be placed there, and he was also the one who had ensured the chamber was entirely empty. He wanted Grant to reveal his true nature in front of everyone, and Grant had done exactly as he had expected. Kent said, his voice low, so calm it was almost gentle, "Your hand is shaking, Uncle Grant." A scream tore through the air. "Kent!" June's voice. She screamed his name by instinct, without thought, without calculation. Grant turned his head toward the scream for only half a second, and the gun barrel shifted off target. Walsh rushed in from behind, forced Grant down into the chair, and locked his arms behind his back. The gun fell onto the wooden tabletop, the sound of metal striking wood ringing through the silent room. Grant shouted, struggling, but Walsh held him tight. He screamed denials, curses, justifications, but no one in the room looked at him anymore. They looked at June, the 27-year-old flower girl from the South Side, still holding Eleanor Gallagher's card in her hand, standing in the meeting room of the most powerful Mafia family in Chicago, had just revealed the truth that this entire empire had failed to find. Walsh dragged Grant out of the meeting room, 2 guards flanking him on either side. Grant's shouting echoed down the hallway, then gradually faded when the meeting room door closed. The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. No longer the breath-held tension from before, but the emptiness left after a storm had just passed through. More than a dozen members of the Gallagher family sat around the table, looking at one another, looking at the gun still lying on the wooden tabletop, looking at the pieces of evidence arranged neatly in place, and looking at the empty chair where Grant had just been sitting. No one said anything. No one knew what to say. Kent stood, picked up the empty gun from the table, placed it back inside the drawer, then pushed the drawer shut. Then he looked at Perry, nodded. Perry understood. He stood, opened his document case, and took out a stack of papers marked with a red seal. This was Eleanor Gallagher's official will, the original version, prepared more than 1 year earlier, and signed before 2 independent witnesses. Perry had kept it in the office safe all this time, and for the first time, it was opened in front of the entire family. Perry read. His voice was even professional, emotionless, exactly the way a lawyer reads a legal document. The main contents of the will were brief and clear, true to Eleanor's style, the style of a woman who never wasted a single word. The first condition: Kent Gallagher would continue to lead the family with full authority to decide every operation. But Eleanor set out one requirement, not a suggestion, but a requirement, that Kent must begin gradually moving the family's operations into legality within 5 years. She wrote that she had watched her husband die young because of the underworld, and she didn't want to watch her son follow that same road. This was her final wish, and she believed Kent was strong enough to carry it out. The second condition: Grant Gallagher was stripped of all power, position, and shares within the family. Not 1 cent, not 1 seat, not 1 voice. Eleanor had known for a long time that Grant couldn't be trusted, and this will was her way of removing him from the game forever. That was the very reason Grant had to act before the will was announced. Perry continued reading. The third condition: a sum of money would be taken from the charity fund supporting small business owners in the South Side, a fund Eleanor had established more than 10 years earlier, and reserved specifically for rebuilding and maintaining the flower shop at its exact location in Southside Chicago. That sum was small compared with the family's total assets, so insignificant that no one in the room had any reason to object. But for a flower girl who was 3 months behind on storefront rent and had just lost her shop in an overnight fire, it was an entire world. A few family members looked at June, beginning to understand why this girl was present here. Then Perry stopped. From inside his document case, he took out a small cream-colored envelope, sealed shut, with the familiar, slightly trembling handwriting on the front. For June. Perry looked at Kent. Kent nodded. Perry opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter, 1 single page, blue-black ink on white paper, the writing small and slanted, every stroke trembling a little, as if the person writing had been growing weaker, but was still trying to keep every word clear. Perry read aloud. June, if you are hearing these words, it means I didn't make it through. I'm sorry for pulling you into my family's affairs. But I had no other choice. I knew someone was harming me. I knew that person was right inside this house, but I couldn't tell my son, because I was afraid he would charge straight into confrontation without thinking of the consequences. He is strong, but he is hot-tempered, and the person behind this is patient, so I chose another way. I sent a message through flowers, because I knew you would be able to read it. Your grandmother once told me that you had eyes that knew how to listen. I believed her, and I was right. Dear June, I'm not leaving you much, only enough to keep the flower shop alive. But I want you to know that the shop is more important than you think. Keep it alive, because the world needs people who know how to listen to a language no one else is willing to learn. Perry finished reading the final line. He folded the letter and placed it gently on the table. There was no sound in the meeting room except breathing. More than a dozen powerful men sat around the table. Men used to orders, transactions, threats, and the ruthless rules of the underworld. And now they sat in silence, looking at a handwritten letter from an old woman to a flower girl, and not one of them could speak. Because Eleanor Gallagher, even from beneath the earth, was still the strongest person in this room. She had seen the enemy when no one else saw him. She had sent out an accusation when no one else was listening, and she had chosen the right person to hold her final secret. June stood in the middle of the room. Tears ran silently down both sides of her face, with no sobs. Her hands clutched the old card Eleanor had sent to her through the flower basket, the card she had tucked into her bag and forgotten. The card she now understood was the thread connecting her to a woman she had never met face to face, but who had trusted her with her life. She didn't wipe her tears. She didn't bow her head. She stood straight, in the middle of a room full of Mafia faces, and cried the way people cry when they realize they have been loved by a stranger without ever knowing it. Kent looked at her. He sat in the chair at the head of the table, both hands resting on the arms of the chair, his back straight, his face still the cold face everyone was used to seeing. But his eyes were red. The rims of his eyes were red, faintly, just enough to notice if someone looked closely. He didn't turn away. He didn't hide it. He watched June cry, watched the card in her hand, watched his mother's letter on the table, and let those reddened eyes remain exactly where they needed to be. This was the woman his mother had chosen, had trusted, had given her final words to. And this was the woman who had read the language that no one in his entire family had understood. Kent Gallagher, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago, sat in his own family meeting room with red eyes, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see that as weakness. 3 months after the night of the family meeting, Grant Gallagher no longer existed in any Gallagher family record. His assets were seized. His name was erased from every ownership document. The doors of the mansion closed in his face forever. Kent didn't deal with him directly. He sent all the evidence through an intermediary attorney, with no connection to the Gallagher family, and that evidence reached the Illinois State Police as an anonymous case file. 2 weeks later, Grant was arrested at a roadside motel to the south while trying to flee the state. Nolan received a lighter sentence because he cooperated and told the whole truth. Kent began doing something he had never imagined he would do in his entire life. He sat with Attorney Perry every week, reviewing each area of the family's operations, slowly beginning to move them into legitimate business. Slowly, carefully, in Kent's way, not rushed, but irreversible. He didn't do it because he wanted to change. He did it because his mother had asked him to, and Eleanor Gallagher was the only person in the world Kent obeyed, even when she was no longer alive. In the South Side, June Whitfield's little flower shop rose again from the ashes. It wasn't the old shop, because the old shop had burned to ash, but it stood at the same address, with the same storefront, and the same little bell hanging over the door, ringing every time a customer stepped inside. June designed everything again with her own hands. New flower shelves, a new sales counter, a new work table. But there was one old thing, her grandmother's photograph. Not the original photograph, because that one had burned with the shop, but a copy that an old neighbor had kept for many years and brought to June when he heard she was reopening. The black and white photograph showed her grandmother standing in front of the shop on opening day, smiling, holding a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. June hung it right behind the counter, exactly where it used to be, where anyone stepping into the shop could see it. Every Saturday afternoon, June opened the shop later than usual, not to sell flowers, but to teach. 4 or 5 children from the neighborhood would come in, sit around the work table, and June taught them the language of flowers. She taught them that every flower had a story, every arrangement had a meaning, and if they were willing to listen, flowers would tell them things people didn't dare say out loud. The children laughed, played with petals, asked all kinds of questions, and June laughed with them. That was the most peaceful moment of her day, the moment when she felt most like her grandmother. One Saturday afternoon, while June was holding a white rose and explaining to the children that white roses meant respect and new beginnings, the familiar black car stopped outside the shop. Kent stepped out. He didn't come in right away. He stood outside the glass door, looking in. June was smiling. For the first time since he had met her, he saw her truly smile. Not the polite smile of a florist greeting a customer, not the strained smile of someone enduring pain, but the natural smile of a person standing exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she had been born to do. Kent stood there for a few more seconds, then pushed the door open. The bell rang softly. The children looked up and saw a tall man in a black suit walking in, their eyes wide. June turned around and saw Kent. She wasn't surprised. She only looked at him, and in that gaze, there was a warmth they had built through trust in the middle of storms, not through promises. Kent walked to the counter and placed a single flower on it. Camellia, the flower whose meaning June had once explained to him late one night at the mansion, when she taught him that the language of flowers wasn't only for the dead, but also for the living. June looked at the camellia on the counter. Then she looked at Kent. She didn't need him to speak. She could read it. Late that afternoon, Kent drove to the cemetery in West Chicago. He went alone, without Walsh, without guards. He carried a bouquet June had arranged especially for him, made with the exact flowers Eleanor had loved. White lilies, white chrysanthemums, and one small branch of the flower June's grandmother had once called the flower of a promise. Kent placed the bouquet before his mother's headstone. He stood there in silence, the evening wind moving softly through the rows of trees behind him. Then he spoke quietly, his voice rough, only loud enough for the woman beneath the earth to hear. "I found the person who could read your flowers, Mother. Sometimes the person who saves you isn't the strongest one, but the one willing to listen to what no one else will hear. Love doesn't always begin at first sight. Sometimes it begins with trust in the middle of a storm, with a bouquet placed in the wrong spot, with a handwritten card from someone about to leave this world. And with the listening eyes of a poor flower girl, the whole world had forgotten, but one mother had not. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it so more people can hear it. How did this story make you feel? Please leave us a comment and tell us what you felt deep in your heart. We always read and treasure every line you share. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the compelling stories we bring you every day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.